Hey everybody, it's Abishur Prakash, aka Mr. Geopolitics. In the last 24 hours, Israel has begun strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and Iran proper. This is a turning point for the Middle East. This is unlike anything Israel has done against Iran in modern times. This eclipses what took place in 2024 when Israel and Iran collided directly. This is a massive, significant geopolitical event that everybody has to pay very close attention to, not just for what's happening right now, but for where it could lead to, for what this means, for how quickly this could escalate into something much bigger. So this is going to be a longer video than normal. There's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of different dimensions and different aspects to go over. Make sure you watch this video until the very end where I discuss what Iran may do next. But before we get into all that, let's start with what has Israel done? What exactly has started? What exactly has Israel targeted? Israel has conducted over 300 strikes on Iran throughout Iranian territory, not just targeting military sites outside of Iran, but targeting installations and facilities and infrastructure throughout the country. Israel has identified and targeted 5 key aspects of Iran: Iran's leadership, Iran's military sites, Iran's nuclear facilities, Iran's military headquarters, and Iran's nuclear scientists. So 5 key aspects of Iran's military and political establishment have been targeted, have been hit, including certain nuclear sites and research facilities that are at the core of Iran's nuclear program. This is being conducted not just through Iran, not just through Israel launching missiles and sending drones, but through long-term planning by the Israeli government, particularly Mossad, where Israel built a drone base within Iran that was then activated to take out Iranian air defense systems and ballistic missile launchers. So this echoes what Mossad was able to achieve when it activated the pagers that were in the hands of Hezbollah, detonating them and killing hundreds, if not thousands, of Hezbollah soldiers. This was meticulous, long-term planning by Israel, who has been preparing for the moment to take decisive action against Iran's nuclear program. For the past several months, Iran's nuclear program and Iran's nuclear progress has been in the spotlight as the US has been conducting diplomatic talks with Iran. The next round of talks were supposed to be this Sunday, but in the last 3 weeks, the talks have faltered. There has been paralysis as the US has demanded that Iran withhold from all uranium enrichment, which the Iranians have responded by saying that's a no-go, even though most of the time nations that have nuclear energy programs, civilian nuclear energy programs, do so for the purpose of energy production. In Iran's case, less than 1% of its electricity comes from its nuclear energy program, which creates even more mystery as to what exactly Iran was doing, even though the Iranian government was saying that its nuclear program is civilian, it's peaceful, it's not for nuclear weapons. So the talks have faltered, have been shaking, the signs have been there, and now Israel has taken unilateral action to paralyze, reverse, destroy the Iranian nuclear weapons development capabilities. This is the key objective of Israel. This took place unilaterally without military support from the United States. This is a key point that Israel has conducted and is conducting, as I speak, operations against Iran without direct American military support. This is a massive shift from the past, and including from many who have analyzed Israel's military and who have come to the conclusion that Israel could not have struck Iran without US help. This has just happened, and it is once again a sign that in this new era of geopolitics, nations are acting in very unprecedented ways, in ways that challenge the expectations, the assumptions, and the very strong-held beliefs that all of us have about how nations and regions and the world at large work. So that is what has happened. Israelis are warning that these military operations against Iran will continue indefinitely. They could last days, they could last weeks, until Iran's nuclear weapons program is completely dismantled and reversed. Now, this itself is a daunting task, because this isn't just about taking certain types of uranium enrichment facilities offline, targeting Iranian nuclear scientists, taking out heads of the Iranian military who are indirectly and directly driving Iran's nuclear weapon program. This is also about striking certain facilities that lie hundreds of kilometers below the surface. So this is going to require a new kind of military ingenuity by Israel. And at this point, if Israel takes out all of the other facilities but cannot take out certain bunkers and facilities stored deep underground, Israel may then turn towards the US. So this is what has happened. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is a turning point for the Middle East. This is a turning point for Israel and Iran, and this should not be viewed through the same lens as what took place in April of last year, when Iran launched over 300 missiles and drones at Israel after Israel struck an Iranian consulate, Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus. It should not be viewed as what took place later in the year, later last year, when Iran launched over 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, and Israel responded, taking out key air defense systems in Iran in October that largely went under the radar, but now can be seen as proactive planning by Israel for some kind of future military operation, which is what is happening right now. So this is what Israel has done. This is what has happened. Now comes, what does this mean? How should the world make sense of this? What are the shockwaves? Where will this lead to? What does this mean from a broader sense? How should the world make sense of what is taking place? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do want to divide the shockwaves into two categories. The first is these narrow shockwaves that need to be understood, and the second is the holistic consequences of what's happening. So to start with, narrow is, will this lead to the collapse of the Iranian government as it stands today? There are protests now in Iran against the government. The war that was plaguing Iran's proxies has now reached Iran proper. Israel is actively launching strikes against not just Iranian military facilities, but against Iran itself, against the Iranian government. The head of the IRGC has been taken out. Top Iranian leadership has been taken out. There is also the quiet and muted threat by Israel that it could have taken out the Iranian Ayatollah, but it didn't, which itself speaks volumes. So if these military operations continue to chip away at Iran's government, at the current regime, could this result in the Iranian state collapsing and a new government emerging in its place? This has been on the minds of many since the Islamic Revolution 40 years ago. This could be a defining moment for the Iranian government, for the Iranian regime, especially considering the Iranian economy and society is already in a very fragile state. There's truckers' protests that are rapidly spreading to over 130 cities in Iran because the Iranian government is tripling and quadrupling, or was planning to, the price of fuel by the end of this month. There's rolling blackouts taking place now that last 3 to 4 hours in Iranian cities because Iran doesn't have access to the resources it needs. These sanctions have deteriorated Iran's ability to renovate its energy infrastructure. Iran's currency has lost a tremendous value since the US pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in Trump's first term. So Iran is in a very fragile state, and this could be what finally puts an end to the Iranian regime in a very challenging, but also a very unexpected way. So that's the first narrow shockwave that has to be understood. The second is that what is taking place between Israel and Iran is now the second month of a unique war. May saw India and Pakistan go to war. Now we're seeing Israel and Iran effectively go to war. So every month, geopolitical activity is ticking up, not just in the established flashpoints, but in the flashpoints that have, until a short time ago, simply been brewing, but the door has remained shut. Now, last month, largely out of nowhere, a terrorist attack took place in Kashmir. India and Pakistan went to war on a scale that hasn't been seen since the 1970s. Now, Israel and Iran, out of nowhere once again, are clashing in ways that has never happened in modern times. And this leads to a new aspect of geopolitics, which is that the threshold of war is rising, which means that nations are able to get away and do a lot more without actually igniting a full-blown war. Is India and Pakistan were able to hit each other and get bloody. India struck Pakistan directly. In the same light, Israel is taking action against Iran, but it's not leading to a full-scale regional war because the stakes are too big. So this is the new status quo, not just India, Pakistan, not just Israel and Iran, but from Ukraine, Russia, to what could take place next with China and Taiwan. The world has to view military action as not the start of war, but now an accepted phenomenon that nations could fight, could launch missiles, could launch drones, could inflict serious damage on one another, but it will not lead to war. So the threshold of war has risen dramatically, and this is the new paradigm and the new lens everybody has to look at what's taking place in the Middle East through. The last narrow shockwave is that Iran is on its last legs when it comes to diplomatic negotiations, when it comes to appeasement, and when it comes to its current state and phase as a nation. And because Iran may feel that this is the end of the line when it comes to whatever its geopolitical strategy has been so far, if Iran feels that this is it, then it could lead to very unhinged, very dangerous behavior, not just on the part of the Iranian government in terms of retaliation, which I'll get to at the end of this video, but also on the part of Iranian proxies, most of which have been largely decimated, like Hamas and Hezbollah. Now the onus is on groups like the Houthis and also the militias in Iraq. Iran has lost Syria in the past couple of months too, as US and Turkish-backed groups take over the country, and Trump met the head of Syria and is effectively reintroducing Syria back into the global community. So Iran is now going to depend more on the Houthis in Yemen and its proxies in Iraq and use them to say, this is it. This is our time to make a stand. This could be the end of our phase in our time. And because of this mentality, Iran may activate, green light the most dramatic, the most dangerous, the most escalatory moves like massive ballistic missile strikes on civilian centers in Israel, pushing this conflict into more unstable waters. That's the narrow shockwaves. Now comes the holistic shockwaves. The first is that this is a big gamble for America. Trump, just hours before the Israeli strikes, said that an Israeli attack is not imminent, but he could see it happening. Then Israel attacked Iran. Now, what exactly happened here, considering Israel did not depend on American military support? Israel did depend on American intelligence support, but Israel largely carried out this mission itself and the existing and current missions itself. For America, this is a big gamble about whether the world now trusts the US president or whether the world now fears the US president. Many US adversaries may view this, Israel's strikes on Iran, as a sign that Trump is saying one thing publicly but doing something else behind closed doors. This could mean that US adversaries increasingly distrust what the US president says and view them as mixed signals, as optics, as psychological warfare, and in turn do the opposite of what Trump is saying he wants. So this could create a new level of uncertainty and distrust towards America. Or on the other hand, it could open the door to nations realizing what Trump is willing to do if they don't meet his diplomatic demands. This attack on Iran has taken place one day after the 60-day window expired for the US and Iran to make a deal. On the 61st day, Israel struck Iran. That's not a coincidence. That's about strategic patience and strategic planning. In the same light, others, US adversaries and US competitors, may feel that if they don't meet certain US demands, and not just when it comes to war or security or defense, but even trade, then Trump may open the doors to chaos. And again, this doesn't mean that the US is going to conduct military strikes on nations that don't do what it wants, but it does mean that the mindset of Trump is that if you don't meet my demands within my window and my time frame, then I am going to disrupt you in tremendous ways, economically, defense-wise, financially, sanctions-wise. So this is a gamble by Trump, whether it makes the world trust America more and fear America more and trust that America will do what it's saying, or whether it makes the world distrust America, the office of the president, and increasingly view the US and what it's saying with more and more suspicion. So that's the first holistic shockwave. The second holistic shockwave for the US is that this could be Trump's Ukraine. Trump has repeatedly criticized US President Biden, former US President Biden, that if Trump were president during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that Russia would have actually not invaded Ukraine and that Trump could have stopped it in its track. Now, Israel has conducted and is conducting massive strikes in Iran. The door is open to war, even though the escalatory ladder has been raised, the threshold of war has been raised, but the direction the ball is moving in is war. This is all happening on Trump's watch. India-Pakistan happened on Trump's watch. So the big question is whether, if this situation snowballs and escalates, will this become Trump's Ukraine? And how does this then affect Trump's own outlook and Trump's own perception in the world, especially one that he's created himself, that under his watch, war does not begin? Because under his watch, two wars, two small skirmishes, conflicts have begun, and the current one between Israel and Iran has the potential to dramatically escalate. So for Trump, his own criticisms of Biden may now be lobbied against him, may now do a complete 180 and have a boomerang effect. Third is that the reliance on institutions and global governance is really eroding past the point of no return. The IAEA was accused by Iran of effectively being in bed with Israel, and Iranians are now likely to view IAEA and the broader United Nations as playing a dirty game with geopolitics. And if the Iranians view these institutions this way, it's not too far to imagine the Russians and the Chinese and other nations that have their own hang-ups with the West also viewing global governance through a very critical lens. So global governance and institutions that have managed the world, have managed world affairs, but whose role has also been in question in the past couple of years. Many nations are questioning the relevance of the UN in light of Trump's trade and tariff wars. The role and purpose of the WTO is up in the air. But when it came to these very dramatic events like war, it was hoped that these institutions and structures could play a de-escalatory role, could deter such events from being sparked and ignited. Now, the opposite has happened once in May between India and Pakistan, now once again in June between Israel and Iran. Nations may start to view global governance, global institutions, global structures as inconsequential, as incompetent, as irrelevant to the current geopolitical climate. The other holistic consequence is that this fight between Israel and Iran risks drawing in other nations, and not just in terms of Arab countries picking sides, refusing to allow Israel to access their airspace, fearful of Iranian retaliation, not just through Iran hitting U.S. bases in the Middle East, further pulling the U.S. into the conflict. Those are the known ways, the predictable ways that other nations could be drawn into this latest flare-up between Israel and Iran. But there are other ways emerging too. For example, right after the Israeli strikes, the first wave of Israeli strikes, Pakistan secured its airspace, activated on a new level its air defenses, and its military readiness took it to new highs out of fear that Iran could target the U.S. embassies and U.S. consulates in Pakistan. Iran is holding the U.S. liable and responsible as much as it's holding Israel liable and responsible. Iran does not see a difference between the U.S. and Israel, even though the U.S. is saying it did not support militarily the Israeli operations. For Iran, these two countries are operating as one against Iranian interests. So Pakistan raised its military readiness in anticipation that its own diplomatic footprint could be hit. And if this is now what's at stake, where Iran could begin to hit U.S. consulates and embassies, or even Western consulates and embassies, if Iran feels that other nations are helping defend Israel, or if other nations do decide to defend Israel, then it could quickly draw in other nations in Eurasia if Iran decides to strike those countries. So there is a high potential that other geographies and other states could be roped into this fight between Israel and Iran. Another way that this could happen is if Iran decides to sink certain trade vessels from other countries in order to paralyze the global economy. If trade vessels start being submerged and sunk in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, in the Indian Ocean by Iranian naval forces, then it will draw in those economies and those nations and those businesses too. Nothing is off the table at this point, considering the scale of what is taking place. And the last global consequence is, what does this mean for the Russia-Ukraine war? This may seem like in very two different flashpoints that have no real overlap or convergence, but Russia is heavily reliant on Iran, particularly for drones. And there are now discussions that Iranian missile technology and Iranian missiles themselves could be transferred to Russia. Russia is already depending on North Korea for long-range artillery shells. Same now comes for the Iranian drones that Russians have been deploying against Ukraine. If Iran is engaged in a major flare-up with Israel that has no end date or lasts days, weeks, or even months, then Iran will prioritize its stockpile, its inventory, its factories, its production for itself. And this could result in Iran cutting the flow of military aid to Russia, which could have its own cascading effect on Russia's ability to strike Ukraine. Russia has been suffering significant losses, including by the massive drone operation that Ukraine conducted against Russia, which took out a significant percentage of Russian strategic bombers. Now Russia needs to gain territory as part of its spring offensive. If it does not have access to the Iranian drones, it could change Russia's own military strategy and goals. So what takes place next between Israel and Iran, what is taking place between Israel and Iran, will have a direct impact on the Russia-Ukraine war. And surrounding all of these holistic shockwaves is that diplomacy is effectively dead. This is something I've been saying for a long time, and now once again it's being proven, which is that nations are, even in the pursuit of diplomacy, are unable to find a middle ground. We used to live in an era where nations, for the sake of economic growth, development, rising up as a society and economy, would meet others halfway, would even accept very unfair conditions, knowing they could prosper long term. But in the current geopolitical dynamics, nations are refusing to bend the knee, nations are refusing to meet halfway, nations are doubling down in their positions, and diplomacy is becoming more and more ineffective. And in turn, the idea of war, the idea of throwing a punch, is not only being accepted and acceptable, it is becoming the new status quo. Countries are ready to get bloody. Nations and the world have become desensitized to war. This is the new terrain that everybody is standing on. So first, what has Israel done, which itself is a turning point for the Middle East? Then, what are the shockwaves? What does this mean for Iran, for the US, for Israel, for the Middle East, for the world? Because this is not just a small skirmish of a few dozen drones, and both nations are already trying to save face, and both nations are already pushing the idea of talks. We're not at that stage yet. We're far from it, if that day comes in the near term. Now comes the big question of how Iran will retaliate. Iran is in a very challenging position in terms of its ability to retaliate for multiple reasons, but the biggest reason is that the US is there to defend Israel, and on top of that, Iran has a limited ability to retaliate, to respond. Iran cannot produce armaments on the same scale as Russia. Iran cannot sustain a war the way Russia has been able to sustain a war, even though Russia is under the barrage of 20,000 sanctions. Iran is the second most sanctioned country in the world, but it doesn't have the economic resources or ability to fight a long-scale and long-term war. So this means that Iran has to use its military resources in a very strategic way. And what this could result in is not a single response by Iran, but a very multi-dimensional response that once again draws in the world. There is the growing likelihood that in the next 24 to 48 hours, Iran will respond with a huge missile attack against Israel, seeking to overwhelm Israeli air defenses, missile defenses, similar to what Iran did last year. But there's a big difference between last year and now, which is that last year, Israel struck Iran, Iran struck back. A lot of it was saving face. A lot of the missiles missed their targets potentially on purpose. This was about optics. Both sides wanted to throw a punch, but both sides did not want to launch a large-scale war. Now, however, Israel is warning that its operations are going to be ongoing. And Israel is not just striking one part of Iran. Israel is conducting operations against Iran, similar to how Israel has conducted operations against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against Houthis. Iran is now war territory. Iran has become a battlefield. And in light of this, Iran has to retaliate, knowing that it's not just going to be a one-off move. So Iran is likely to launch a massive missile burst. But in conjunction to this, Iran may also activate other very dangerous channels, two of which require special attention. The first is that Iran may seek to use its cells, its terrorist cells across the world, and activate them. And these are not just cells in Israel or in the Middle East, but across the Western world that are laying dormant and may be activated by Iran, meaning suicide attacks against embassies, against certain ethnic groups, against certain, potentially even government officials. Iran, feeling it's on its last legs, may launch unbelievably dangerous and destabilizing suicide attacks on the West, bringing the war into Western societies in a new way. The second channel is that there has been growing concern, especially in Nordic countries, that Iran is funding and hiring gangs in those countries to carry out attacks on the behalf of Iran. These are attacks that have been targeting Israeli consulates, Israeli people, Israeli communities, and governments have followed the breadcrumbs and have identified Iran or Iranian affiliated groups as the people and organizations hiring these gangs for their missions. This could now be raised to new heights. Iran may use these gangs throughout the Western world to conduct even more dangerous, even more bloody missions and hits on targets that Iran cannot reach itself. So this once again draws in the West and Western societies and Western people and Western communities into this fight between Israel and Iran that has only just begun. This is a fight that, as Israel is warning, will last days, if not weeks, because Israel's key objective is to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities. That is the concluding takeaway of this video, which is that the key objective is to reverse Iran's ability to produce a nuclear bomb. What happens as a result of that objective, like the Iranian regime collapsing, is secondary. The world could see over the next week and a half Iran's nuclear weapons program being destroyed or being reversed by decades. And in the turn of that, the end of that, Israel may simply wrap up its operations and declare victory. And this brings the video to an important juncture, which is, what will America do now that Israel has begun conducting military operations against Israel? Israel has begun conducting military operations against Iran. The question in front of the U.S. is whether it will stand on the sidelines and simply defend Israel from Iranian retaliation, or whether it will play a direct role and also begin striking Iran. And a lot of this hedges on what U.S. President Donald Trump has said, which is that there is still time for Iran to make a deal. But this is rather a strange statement, because as it stands right now, Iran is not going to make a deal under a barrage of missiles, under a barrage of drones, in a state of war. There's very slim chance that Iran is going to come to the negotiating table. So with diplomacy paralyzed, will the US switch gears and align with what Israel is doing? And if so, it leads to a bigger question, which is, at what point does the US and Israel feel that their objective has been met? What has to happen? What are the new conditions that have to form in Iran for Washington and Tel Aviv to stop the military operations? And as of this point, this is a gray area, considering this is what starts as the objective of taking out Iran's nuclear weapons program can quickly become convoluted by the myriad of other factors that surround this, further drawing in Israel and the US into this conflict, and in turn, drawing the world into yet another geopolitical flashpoint. I hope you resonated with this video. Leave your comments below and talk soon.